When my daughter-in-law Rebecca handed me a cleaning schedule and told me I'd be earning my keep as the family housekeeper just 1 week after my husband's funeral, I realized the devoted wife who'd cared for my son Marcus had been playing a role all along. But what Rebecca didn't know was that I'd spent 42 years as a civil rights attorney, specializing in elder abuse and discrimination cases, and the legal precedents I'd established in courtrooms across the state would soon teach her exactly why you should never try to exploit a grieving widow who knows the law better than most judges. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of justice and dignity resonate with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because by the end of this story, you'll see how one 73-year-old woman turned the tables on someone who thought age meant powerlessness. My name is Margaret Sterling, and at 73, I thought I'd hung up my legal robes for good. After 4 decades of fighting discrimination cases, protecting the vulnerable, and establishing landmark precedents for elder rights, I'd looked forward to a quiet retirement with my beloved husband Thomas in our Riverside home. We'd built a beautiful life together, 48 years of marriage, watching our only son Marcus grow into a successful pediatric surgeon, and finally having time to travel, garden, and enjoy the fruits of our labor. But if there's one thing my years in the courtroom taught me, it's that life has a way of calling you back when you least expect it. And the call came exactly 1 week after my husband's funeral, in the form of a cleaning schedule handed to me by my daughter-in-law Rebecca, along with the words that would change everything. You'll be earning your keep as our household manager, now. Thomas had been my rock through every challenging case, every late night preparing briefs, every courtroom battle against those who preyed on the elderly and defenseless. You're their champion, Maggie, he'd say when I'd come home exhausted from particularly difficult cases. Someone has to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. I never imagined that one day I'd need to stand up for myself. Tharmi. Irony wasn't lost on me. For 42 years, I'd specialized in exactly this kind of case: elder abuse, financial exploitation, family members who saw aging relatives as burdens rather than blessings. I'd written the legislation that protected senior citizens from predatory family members in 3 counties. I'd established legal precedents that had safeguarded thousands of vulnerable elderly people from exactly the situation I now found myself in. But when you're in the middle of grief, when your world has been shattered by loss, even the strongest armor can feel paper thin. I was in our sunroom on that crisp October morning, tending to the orchids Thomas had loved so much, when the phone call came that shattered my world. Dr. Patricia Huang from Riverside Medical Center, calling to tell me that my Thomas, my strong, healthy 75-year-old husband who still jogged 3 miles every morning and could debate constitutional law over breakfast, had suffered a massive heart attack during his routine dental appointment. Mrs. Sterling, I'm so sorry. Dr. Huang's voice was gentle but professional. The paramedics did everything they could, but the cardiac event was too severe. He wouldn't have suffered. The orchid I'd been watering slipped from my hands, the terracotta pot shattering against the sunroom floor as I tried to process what this stranger was telling me. Thomas, who had argued his last case just 6 months ago at 75, who had been planning our anniversary trip to Ireland, who had made me coffee that very morning and kissed my forehead before leaving for his appointment, was gone. I don't remember much about the next few hours. I know Marcus rushed over from the hospital, still in his surgical scrubs, his face a mask of devastation that mirrored my own. I remember Rebecca arriving shortly after, immediately taking charge of the practical matters, calling the funeral home, notifying Thomas's colleagues, organizing the reception that would follow the service. "Don't worry about anything, Mom Sterling," she said, using the affectionate name she'd called me for the past 5 years of her marriage to Marcus. "We'll handle everything. You just focus on processing this loss." Rebecca seemed especially attentive during those first few days, staying close during the funeral planning, handling phone calls from well-wishers, ensuring I ate something even when food felt like ash in my mouth. She coordinated with Thomas's law firm colleagues, managed the flowers, even helped me choose the readings for the service. The funeral itself was a testament to the life Thomas had built. The cathedral was packed with former clients whose rights he'd defended, fellow attorneys who'd learned from his expertise, judges who'd respected his integrity, and community members whose lives he'd touched through pro bono work. Rebecca stood beside me during the service, her hand on my arm, whispering words of comfort as speaker after speaker talked about Thomas's legacy of justice and compassion. Judge Patricia Morrison, who had presided over many of our cases, delivered a particularly moving eulogy. Thomas Sterling didn't just practice law, she said, her voice carrying across the hushed cathedral. He practiced justice. He believed that the measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members, and he spent his career making sure that belief became reality in our courtrooms. I sat in the front pew, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives Thomas had impacted, and felt simultaneously supported and utterly alone. This giant of justice, this man who had made protecting the vulnerable his life's work, was gone. And I was left to navigate a world that suddenly felt very different without his steady presence. After the service, Rebecca continued to be the perfect daughter-in-law. She organized the reception at our country club, ensuring that every detail was handled with dignity and grace. She made sure I met with every colleague and client who wanted to share memories, facilitating conversations when my grief made words difficult. "You've been such a blessing during all this," I told her that evening as the last guests departed. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." "Your family, Mom Sterling," she replied, her smile warm and genuine. "We take care of each other." That's what Thomas would have wanted. In the days that followed, the house felt impossibly empty without Thomas's presence. Every corner held memories that threatened to overwhelm me. His reading chair in the den, where he'd review cases late into the evening. His coffee mug in the kitchen sink, still stained from that final morning. His side of the bed, cold and unfamiliar. "You shouldn't be alone right now," Rebecca said during one of her daily check-in calls. "Why don't you stay with us for a while? The guest room is always ready for you, and it might be good to have family close during this difficult time." The offer seemed like a lifeline. Marcus and Rebecca lived in a beautiful colonial home in Oakmont, one of Riverside's most prestigious neighborhoods. The house was spacious enough that I wouldn't feel like I was intruding, and being around family felt like exactly what I needed as I processed this devastating loss. "Are you sure it wouldn't be an imposition?" I asked, though part of me was already mentally packing a bag. "Don't be ridiculous," Rebecca laughed. "You practically raised Marcus into the wonderful man he is today. The least we can do is take care of you when you need us most." I moved into their guest room 3 days after the funeral, bringing just enough clothes and personal items for what I assumed would be a temporary stay. The room was beautifully appointed with antique furniture and a view of Rebecca's prize-winning rose garden. It felt like a refuge from the overwhelming memories of the house Thomas and I had shared. For the first week, Rebecca maintained the same level of care and attention she'd shown during the funeral preparations. She made sure I had everything I needed, invited me to join them for meals, and encouraged me to use the house as my own. Marcus, when he wasn't at the hospital, was equally attentive, sharing memories of his father and making sure I felt welcome and loved. But exactly 1 week after we laid Thomas to rest, Rebecca knocked on my guest room door at 7 a.m. with a clipboard in hand and a smile that no longer reached her eyes. "Margaret," she said, not Mom Sterling anymore, I noticed with a chill of unease. "We need to discuss your living situation moving forward." I was still in my robe, having been awakened by her purposeful knock. The formal tone of her voice immediately put me on alert, triggering instincts honed through decades of recognizing when a conversation was about to take an unwelcome turn. "Of course," I said carefully, gesturing for her to come in. What's on your mind? She entered the room with the confidence of someone who had clearly rehearsed this conversation, settling into the antique chair near the window while I remained, standing by the bed, suddenly feeling vulnerable in my nightwear. The reality is, Rebecca began, consulting her clipboard with businesslike efficiency, that with Marcus working such demanding hours at the hospital and my career in pharmaceutical, sales requiring extensive travel, we've decided you can stay, but you'll need to contribute meaningfully to the household. She handed me a detailed document that looked like something that might be presented to a potential employee. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Household Management Agreement, Margaret Sterling. Below that was a comprehensive schedule. Daily cleaning routines broken down by room, meal preparation schedules including specific dietary preferences, laundry management with detailed instructions for different fabric types, garden maintenance, and even pool cleaning duties. I stared at the document, my legal mind immediately recognizing what I was looking at. This wasn't a request for help around the house. This was a job description for domestic labor, presented to a grieving widow 1 week after her husband's funeral. I don't understand, I said slowly, though I was beginning to understand all too clearly. You want me to be your housekeeper? I prefer household manager, Rebecca replied with the kind of practiced smile I'd seen countless times in depositions, the expression of someone delivering prepared remarks designed to sound reasonable while masking something far less palatable. It sounds more dignified, don't you think? And really, Margaret, this arrangement benefits everyone involved. She leaned forward, her tone taking on the patronizing quality that I recognized from my years of representing elderly clients who'd been condescended to by family members with ulterior motives. The reality is that maintaining this house is expensive. Your Social Security checks, while I'm sure they seem adequate to you, don't really cover much in today's economy. And frankly, we can't afford to support a dependent indefinitely. This arrangement ensures you have a secure place to live while contributing something valuable in return. The word dependent hit me like a physical blow. I, who had argued cases, before the state Supreme Court, who had secured millions in settlements for exploited seniors, who had written the very legislation that protected elder rights in 3 counties. I was being called a dependent by a woman young enough to be my daughter. The tasks are all quite manageable for someone your age, Rebecca continued, apparently, interpreting my silence as acceptance rather than shock. Nothing too strenuous, though we do expect thoroughness and attention to detail. The house has a reputation to maintain in the neighborhood, and with Marcus's position at the hospital, appearances matter. I looked down at the schedule again, this time reading it with the analytical eye that had served me throughout my legal career. The tasks weren't just comprehensive, they were deliberately demeaning, scrubbing floors by hand when there was a perfectly good mop available, cleaning baseboards with a toothbrush, washing all windows inside and out despite my arthritis, maintaining the pool area, which required heavy lifting and chemicals that could be dangerous for someone my age. This wasn't about household help. This was about establishing dominance, about reducing a grieving widow to servitude, about making me so grateful for shelter that I'd accept any humiliation rather than risk homelessness. What does Marcus think about this arrangement? I asked carefully, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Rebecca's smile turned sharp, revealing the calculation that had been lurking beneath her facade of care. Marcus agrees completely. He's been worried about the financial burden of caring for an aging parent, especially given your limited resources. This way, you're contributing rather than just existing as a drain on our household budget. Just existing. As if my entire life's work, my decades of service to the community, my recent devastating loss meant nothing. As if I were merely a burden to be managed rather than a family member to be cherished during one of the most difficult periods of my life. I've also taken the liberty of researching what live-in household managers typically earn in this area, Rebecca continued, pulling another sheet from her clipboard. The going rate is about $800 per month, plus room and board. Quite generous, really, considering your lack of formal experience in domestic service. $800 a month. For what she was describing, a full-time, live-in domestic position, with responsibilities that would consume virtually every waking hour, the local minimum wage for similar work would have been at least $2,500 per month. She wasn't offering me employment. She was offering me exploitation dressed up as charity. "I'll need an answer by tomorrow morning," Rebecca said, standing to leave with the air of someone who considered the matter settled. The first task on your schedule is preparing breakfast for 7 a.m. sharp. I prefer my eggs Benedict with the hollandaise made from scratch. There's a recipe card in the kitchen. Marcus likes his coffee at exactly 185 degrees, and you'll find a thermometer in the drawer next to the stove. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and delivered what was clearly meant to be the final word on the subject. "Oh, and Margaret? I think it goes without saying that this arrangement is contingent on your performance meeting our standards. We're offering you a home and purpose at a time when many women your age find themselves quite alone and unnecessary. I trust you'll appreciate the opportunity we're providing." As the door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded final, I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking as I held the household management agreement that would essentially reduce me to indentured servitude in my own son's home. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else started to take its place. Something Rebecca had badly miscalculated in her assessment of the broken-down widow she thought she was manipulating. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for: Jennifer Walsh, my former law partner who now ran our firm's elder advocacy division. My fingers were steady as I typed, "Jen, I may need to come out of retirement. I think I'm being targeted for exploitation. Can we meet?" Her response came within minutes. "Margaret, whatever you need, if someone's trying to take advantage of you after Thomas's death, they picked the wrong attorney to mess with. Coffee tomorrow at 9? I looked at the cleaning schedule again, this time not as a victim, but as the civil rights attorney who had built her career dismantling exactly this kind of systematic abuse. Rebecca wanted me to be her household manager? Fine. But she was about to learn that Margaret Sterling didn't just manage households. She managed courtrooms, legal precedents, and the complete destruction of anyone foolish enough to exploit the vulnerable. Tomorrow morning, I would make her eggs Benedict with hollandaise from scratch and coffee at precisely 185 degrees. But I would also begin building the legal case that would not only restore my dignity, but establish new protections for every grieving senior who found themselves in similar circumstances. The game Rebecca thought she was winning had just acquired a new set of rules. And in this game, the house always belongs to the lawyer. The next morning arrived with the cruel punctuality that only crisis seems to possess. My internal clock, honed by decades of early morning court appearances, woke me at 5:30 a.m., giving me 90 minutes to prepare breakfast that would meet Rebecca's exacting standards while I processed the magnitude of what was happening to my life. I stood in my guest room, my servants' quarters now apparently, and made a conscious decision about how to approach this day. In my 42 years of legal practice, I'd learned that the most effective strategy when dealing with an adversary was often to let them reveal the full extent of their intentions before mounting any defense. Rebecca thought she was dealing with a helpless widow. I would let her continue thinking that while I gathered intelligence about exactly what kind of operation she was running, the kitchen was a marvel of modern efficiency, granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and every gadget a serious cook could want. Under different circumstances, I might have enjoyed working in such a space. But as I stood there at 6 a.m., reading the detailed recipe card Rebecca had left for eggs Benedict, I felt the weight of every deliberate humiliation she'd built into this arrangement. The hollandaise sauce required constant whisking and precise temperature control, a technique designed to keep me tied to the stove for the better part of an hour. The coffee thermometer had been placed prominently on the counter with a note. Marcus's coffee must be exactly 185 degrees. Use the thermometer every time. Even the placement of dishes had been specified. Serve on the Royal Albert china. Margaret. We'll find it in the upper cabinet. Reach carefully. Everything calculated to remind me of my new position in this household. But as I began the methodical process of preparing breakfast, muscle memory from a different kind of morning routine kicked in. For 4 decades, I'd started each day by reviewing case files, organizing evidence, and preparing for battle in courtrooms across the state. This morning felt no different, except that instead of preparing to defend others, I was gathering intelligence for my own case. My mind wandered back to how I'd built my reputation as one of the state's most formidable civil rights attorneys. It hadn't happened overnight. Like most women entering law in the early 1980s, I'd faced skepticism, condescension, and outright discrimination that would make Rebecca's current behavior seem like amateur hour. I remembered my first major case, representing Mrs. Helen Adamson, an 81-year-old widow whose son and daughter-in-law had convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then systematically looted her savings account while forcing her to work as their unpaid domestic help. The case had every element that would become my specialty: family exploitation, elder abuse, and the assumption that age made someone powerless. The opposing counsel had been a prestigious firm representing the son, a successful businessman who presented himself as a devoted child, caring for his aging mother. They'd painted Mrs. Adamson as confused, senile, and prone to making accusations when her memory failed her. They'd suggested that her domestic contributions were her way of feeling useful rather than evidence of exploitation. I'd spent months building that case, documenting every financial transaction, every instance of abuse, every legal precedent that supported Mrs. Adamson's rights. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man who addressed me as "little lady" throughout the proceedings, had been confident that a jury would see an ungrateful old woman rather than a victim of systematic exploitation. His confidence had evaporated when I'd presented bank records showing $127,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, testimony from neighbors who'd witnessed verbal abuse, and expert testimony about the psychological tactics used to control elderly victims. But the moment that defined my career came during my closing argument, when I'd looked directly at that condescending defense attorney and said, "Opposing counsel seems to believe that age makes someone less worthy of protection under the law. I'm here to remind this jury that dignity doesn't have an expiration date." The jury had awarded Mrs. Adamson $300,000 in damages and ordered the return of every stolen dollar. More importantly, the case had established legal precedent that made it easier for other elderly victims to seek justice. Mrs. Adamson had lived comfortably for another 12 years, sending me a Christmas card every year until her peaceful death. At 93, that case had launched my career, but it was far from my last victory. Over the decades, I'd represented hundreds of seniors who'd been financially exploited, emotionally abused, or physically neglected by family members who saw them as burdens rather than blessings. I'd helped establish mandatory reporting laws for suspected elder abuse, created legal protections for seniors entering into power of attorney agreements, and written legislation that made it a felony to financially exploit elderly family members. But perhaps my most satisfying victory had come just 3 years ago, in the case of Coleman versus Coleman. Michael Coleman had attempted to have his 78-year-old father declared incompetent after the older man refused to sign over control of his hardware store chain. Michael had painted his father as confused and deteriorating, claiming the business was suffering under his senile management. The reality was that the father, Richard Coleman, was sharper than most people half his age. He'd simply refused to let his son sell the family business to a corporate chain and pocket the profits. Michael had retaliated by filing for guardianship, moving his father into his home, and beginning a campaign of psychological manipulation designed to break the old man's will. By the time Richard Coleman found his way to my office, smuggled, There, by a concerned neighbor, he'd been reduced to asking permission to use the bathroom in his own son's house. The bruises on his arms told a story that complemented the financial records I'd uncovered, showing Michael had already begun transferring business assets to shell companies. That case had taken 18 months to resolve, but the outcome had been devastating for Michael Coleman. Not only had I successfully defended his father's competency and business ownership, but I'd also convinced the district attorney to file criminal charges for elder abuse and financial exploitation. Michael Coleman had ended up serving 2 years in state prison, while his father had enjoyed 5 more years of running his business before selling it on his own terms to the employees who'd helped him build it. These memories flooded back as I whisked hollandaise sauce at Rebecca's granite counter, reminding me of who I was beneath the grief and vulnerability that had made me an easy target. I wasn't just Margaret Sterling, the broken widow. I was Margaret Sterling, Esquire, the attorney who had made a career out of dismantling exactly the kind of scheme Rebecca was attempting to run on me. The irony was almost amusing. Of all the elderly widows Rebecca could have chosen to exploit, she'd picked the one person in the state with the specific expertise and track record to destroy her. Marcus appeared in the kitchen at 6:45, already dressed in his surgical scrubs, looking tired and distracted. For a moment, seeing my son in his professional attire, I felt a surge of the maternal pride that had carried me through his childhood, his medical school years, and his rise to become one of the city's most respected pediatric surgeons. "Good morning, Mom," he said, using the simple title that had always been enough before Rebecca's influence. "You're up early." "Rebecca asked me to prepare breakfast," I said carefully, watching his face for any sign that he understood the implications of that request. "Oh." He looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the hallway where Rebecca's voice could be heard on a phone call. "Yeah, she mentioned something about you helping out around the house. I think it's good for you to have something to focus on, you know? Staying busy helps with grief." The casual way he dismissed what was happening, as if exploiting his recently widowed mother was simply grief therapy, told me everything I needed to know about how Rebecca had framed this arrangement. She'd convinced him that reducing me to domestic servitude was actually beneficial for my mental health. "Marcus," I said gently, "do you remember when you were 12 and that boy Kevin Patterson was bullying the younger kids at school?" He looked puzzled by the apparent change of subject. "Yeah, I remember. You told me that sometimes bullies pick on people they think can't fight back, and that it was my responsibility to speak up for those who couldn't speak up for themselves. Do you remember what you did?" I reported him to the principal. "Got him suspended for a week?" Marcus smiled at the memory. "You were proud of me for standing up to someone bigger than me." "I was proud of you for protecting the vulnerable," I corrected gently, "for recognizing that being bigger or stronger doesn't give someone the right to hurt others." He looked confused, clearly not making the connection I was hoping he'd make. Before I could say more, Rebecca swept into the kitchen, her phone call apparently concluded. "Margaret, I hope breakfast is progressing according to schedule," she said, not bothering to greet her husband. "I have an important client meeting this morning and can't afford to be late." "Of course," I replied, plating the eggs Benedict with the precision she'd demanded. "Coffee is at exactly 185 degrees. "Perfect." She tasted the hollandaise sauce with the air of a restaurant critic evaluating a particularly challenging dish. "Acceptable. Perhaps a touch more lemon next time." Marcus kissed her cheek as he grabbed his coffee, the gesture automatic and distracted. "I'll probably be late tonight. We have a complex surgery scheduled this afternoon." "Don't wait up for me either," Rebecca replied. "I'm having dinner with the Hendersons to discuss their pharmaceutical contract. Margaret, you'll find the cleaning supplies in the utility closet. I've left detailed instructions on the counter for today's tasks." As they both left for their respective careers, my son to save children's lives, my daughter-in-law to negotiate drug contracts, I stood alone in the kitchen with a list of demeaning tasks and a growing understanding of the psychological warfare Rebecca was waging. The cleaning schedule was even more elaborate than I'd initially realized. Each room had been assigned specific tasks that would take the entire day to complete. Bathrooms were to be scrubbed with bleach and cleaned with a digi toothbrush. Hardwood floors were to be mopped and then hand-polished on hands and knees. Windows needed to be cleaned inside and out, despite the fact that professional window cleaners had obviously been there recently. But it wasn't just the physical demands that revealed Rebecca's true intentions. It was the psychological elements she'd built into the arrangement. Each task came with detailed instructions that assumed incompetence. Use exactly 1/4 cup of bleach in the toilet bowl cleaner. More will damage the fixtures, less won't clean properly. Polish furniture with circular motions, not back and forth. Margaret should be familiar with proper technique. Every instruction was designed to reinforce the message that I was an employee, not family. That my decades of professional expertise meant nothing in this household. That I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve rather than expecting to be served in my time of grief. As I began the systematic humiliation Rebecca had planned for my day, I found myself thinking about the psychological profile I'd developed over the years for people who exploited elderly family members. They typically fell into one of 3 categories: the desperate, who were motivated by genuine financial crisis; the addicted, who were driven by gambling, drugs, or other compulsions; and the entitled, who simply believed that their wants took priority over an elderly person's dignity. Rebecca clearly fell into the 3rd category. This wasn't about money. Marcus was a successful surgeon, and Rebecca's pharmaceutical career was obviously lucrative given their lifestyle. This was about power, control, and the deep-seated belief that age made someone less worthy of respect. The house itself told a story of success and ambition. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen artwork, every meticulously maintained detail spoke of people who cared deeply about appearances and status. But as I cleaned each room according to Rebecca's specifications, I began to notice things that suggested a different story. The master bedroom contained evidence of separate sleeping arrangements, his and hers everything, from alarm clocks to reading lights. The walk-in closet revealed a massive collection of designer clothes with tags still attached, suggesting spending that prioritized appearance over practicality. Most telling were the multiple credit card statements I found while dusting Rebecca's home office. Statements that revealed balances suggesting their lifestyle might be more financially precarious than it appeared. But it was in Marcus's study that I found the most revealing evidence of what was really happening in this household. Medical journals were mixed with financial planning books, suggesting my son was concerned about money in ways he'd never been before. A notebook on his desk contained calculations, mortgage payments, insurance premiums, retirement projections, all in handwriting that revealed stress and worry. On his computer desk, partially hidden under other papers, I found a brochure for Sunset Manor, an assisted living facility across town. The brochure was well thumbed, with handwritten notes in the margins about costs and availability. Notes that included my name. Rebecca hadn't just decided to exploit me as domestic help. She'd been planning to remove me from their home entirely, sending me to institutional care while presumably maintaining control over any assets I might have. The domestic servitude wasn't the endgame. It was the trial run, the way to establish that I was indeed a burden who couldn't care for myself. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. By reducing me to a domestic servant, Rebecca was building a narrative that I was declining, possibly incompetent, certainly incapable of independent living. The assisted living facility would be presented as a kind gesture, a way to ensure I received proper care while relieving Marcus of the burden of housing his aging mother. As I stood in my son's study, holding evidence of a plan to dispose of me like an unwanted piece of furniture, I felt the last vestiges of my grief-induced vulnerability burn away in the face of cold, professional rage. I pulled out my phone and called Jennifer Walsh. "Margaret!" Jennifer's voice was warm with concern. "I've been thinking about you since your message yesterday. Are you okay?" "Jen, I need to move up our coffee meeting. Can you meet me at Riverside Diner at 1 p.m. today?" "Of course. What's going on?" "I'm being systematically exploited by my daughter-in-law, and I have reason to believe she's planning to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized. I need to know what legal options I have." There was a long pause before Jennifer responded, and when she did, her voice carried the steel that had made her one of the state's most effective elder advocates. "Margaret, are you somewhere safe right now?" "Safe, but not secure. I'm gathering evidence, but I need professional consultation before I make any moves. Bring everything you've found. And Margaret, if someone is doing this to you, to Margaret Sterling, then we're not just talking about personal justice. We're talking about sending a message that will protect every elderly person in this state." After hanging up, I continued my assigned cleaning tasks, but now with a different purpose. Every demeaning instruction Rebecca had left, every calculated humiliation, every piece of evidence that revealed her true intentions, I documented it all. By noon, I had photographed the assisted living brochure, the financial calculations, the credit card statements, and the cleaning schedule that would have made a Victorian-era servant blush. I had a detailed timeline of Rebecca's behavior since Thomas's death, including her strategic kindness during the funeral, followed by the immediate pivot to exploitation. Most importantly, I had my professional instincts fully awakened and focused on the kind of case I'd built my career dismantling. As I prepared to leave for my meeting with Jennifer, I looked around the house that Rebecca thought she controlled. She'd made the classic mistake that every opponent I'd faced in court had made. She'd underestimated her adversary. Rebecca saw a grief-stricken widow who could be manipulated and controlled. She had no idea she was dealing with the attorney, who had written the legal playbook for prosecuting exactly the crimes she was committing. The game was about to change, and Margaret Sterling was back in play. Before I tell you about the legal war that was about to unfold, you need to understand what Rebecca was truly trying to destroy. This wasn't just about reducing me to domestic servitude. It was about obliterating the foundation of love, respect, and dignity that Thomas and I had spent 48 years building together, and that had shaped our son Marcus into the man he'd become before Rebecca's influence began to poison everything we held sacred. The Riverside Diner sat on the corner of Main and Elm, unchanged from the day Thomas had first brought me there on our second date in 1975. The red vinyl booths, the black and white checkered floor, the jukebox that still played songs from the 1950s. It was a time capsule of simpler values, where a handshake meant something and family bonds were considered sacred. I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a manila folder that contained the evidence I'd gathered during my morning of domestic servitude. As I slid into our usual booth, the one where Thomas and I had shared countless meals over nearly 5 decades, the weight of what I was about to do settled over me like a familiar legal brief. Jennifer Walsh arrived precisely at 1 p.m., her silver hair pulled back in the efficient style that had become her trademark during 30 years of courtroom battles. She was 5 years younger than me, but had been my protégé in the early days, learning the intricacies of elder law under my guidance. Before establishing herself as one of the state's most formidable advocates for senior rights, "Margaret," she said, sliding into the booth across from me with the same intensity she brought to every case. "You look like hell, but your eyes look like you're ready for war." "Because I am," I replied, opening the folder between us. "But first, I need you to understand what Rebecca is trying to tear down. Because this isn't just about me. It's about protecting everything Thomas and I built together, and everything we taught Marcus about the way families should treat each other." Jennifer nodded, her legal mind already cataloging the implications. "Tell me about the foundation she's attacking." I looked around the diner, seeing ghosts of memories in every corner. Thomas and I met here in 1975. I was a first-year law student at Riverside University, working nights as a waitress to pay for school. He was a young public defender, already making a name for himself by taking on cases other lawyers wouldn't touch because the clients couldn't pay. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Thomas had come in every Tuesday evening for what he called his thinking dinner, a way to decompress from particularly difficult cases while reviewing files for the next day. He always ordered the same thing: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and coffee black. He always left a $20 tip on a $7 check because he knew most of the waitresses were students struggling to make ends meet. He was different from anyone I'd ever met, I told Jennifer, watching her take notes with the thoroughness that had made our partnership so effective years ago. At a time when most male lawyers saw women in law school as novelties at best and threats at worst, Thomas treated me like an equal colleague from day one. It had taken 3 months of Tuesday dinners before Thomas worked up the courage to ask me out properly. When he did, his proposal was characteristic of the man he was. "Margaret, I've been coming here every week hoping to talk with you about something other than the weather and the daily specials. Would you consider having dinner with me somewhere that serves food I haven't memorized?" Our first real date had been at Giuseppe's, a tiny Italian restaurant that was already ancient when we discovered it. Thomas had been nervous, spilling wine on his tie and apologizing profusely, until I'd laughed and told him that any man who left $20 tips for $7 meals was someone I wanted to know better. He asked me why I'd chosen law. I continued, lost in the memory. Most people assumed I was looking for a husband with good prospects, or that I was some kind of militant feminist making a statement. But Thomas just listened when I told him about my grandmother. My grandmother, Rose Kowalski, had been widowed at 68 when my grandfather died in a factory accident. She'd spent her entire adult life as a housewife and mother, had never worked outside the home, had never even had a checking account in her own name. When Grandpa died, she'd discovered that their son, my Uncle Walter, had been systematically stealing from their savings account for years, leaving her with almost nothing. Uncle Walter convinced everyone that Grandma was getting senile, that she was imagining things when she accused him of theft, I told Jennifer. He had her declared incompetent and moved her into his house, where she became unpaid domestic help for his family while he sold off everything she and Grandpa had worked for. I'd been 16 when I'd watched my proud, intelligent grandmother reduced to a servant in her own son's home, forbidden to speak up for herself, dismissed as confused whenever she tried to assert her rights. She'd died 2 years later, broken and humiliated, while Uncle Walter inherited what little remained of her estate. That's when I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, I said. Thomas understood immediately. He didn't try to talk me out of it or suggest I focus on family law or some other appropriate specialty for women. He said, "The law should protect people like your grandmother. If it doesn't, then lawyers like us need to make it better." Lawyers like us. From the very beginning, Thomas had seen our relationship as a partnership of equals working toward common goals. We'd married in 1977. In a small ceremony at the same church where we'd eventually hold his funeral 46 years later. Thomas had insisted on writing his own vows, promising not just to love and honor me, but to support my career ambitions and work alongside me to make the law more just for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He kept that promise for 48 years, I told Jennifer, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. When I decided to specialize in elder law, he restructured his own practice to complement mine. When I needed to work late preparing for trials, he learned to cook so I'd have decent meals when I got home. When clients couldn't afford to pay, he took on extra pro bono work so we could afford to take cases that mattered. Our partnership had been extraordinary, both professionally and personally. Thomas had been my legal consultant on every major case, the one who helped me see angles I might have missed, who role-played opposing arguments to help me prepare for court. His own practice had focused on criminal defense for the underprivileged, but he'd become nearly as expert in elder law as I was simply through our dinner table discussions about my cases. We had a rule, I continued. Every evening, we'd spend an hour talking about our cases, not as husband and wife, but as colleagues. Thomas would challenge my legal strategies, suggest different approaches, help me think through the ethical implications of difficult decisions. Some of our best legal victories came from ideas that emerged during those conversations. Jennifer smiled, remembering her own experiences working with both of us during her early career. I used to joke that you two had the most romantic discussions about legal precedents I'd ever heard. Because we shared the same values, I said. The same belief that the law should protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. That family bonds came with responsibilities, not just privileges. That dignity wasn't something you lost because you got old or sick or needed help. Those values had shaped every aspect of our life together. When Thomas's father had developed Alzheimer's disease, we'd brought him into our home rather than placing him in institutional care. For 3 years, we'd tag-teamed his care. I'd handle morning routines before going to court. Thomas would manage afternoons and evenings. We'd modified our house to make it safe for someone with cognitive impairment, hired professional help when needed, and ensured that Thomas's father lived his final years with dignity and love. When my mother had her stroke, I told Jennifer, Thomas was the one who suggested we convert the den into a first-floor bedroom so she wouldn't have to navigate stairs. He researched physical therapy options, drove her to appointments, learned to prepare the special diet her doctor recommended. He treated her with the same respect he'd shown when she was healthy and independent. These weren't obligations we'd grudgingly accepted. They were expressions of the values that defined us. As a family, we believed that love meant caring for each other through all of life's stages, that wisdom came with age and deserved respect, that no one should face their final years alone or afraid. And Marcus absorbed all of this, I said, pulling out a photo from my folder, one of my son at age 12, reading to his grandfather during the old man's illness. He grew up seeing how families should treat each other, how you honor your elders, how you support each other through difficulties, how dignity is something you give others, not something you demand for yourself. Marcus had been an exceptional child, not because he was academically gifted, though he was, but because he'd internalized the values Thomas and I had tried to model. He'd been the kid who'd stood up to bullies, who'd volunteered at the senior center, who'd spent his allowance money buying groceries for elderly neighbors who were struggling financially. Remember when he was 16 and decided to spend his summer vacation volunteering at the VA hospital instead of taking that lucrative lifeguarding job? I asked Jennifer, who'd known Marcus since he was small. She nodded, smiling at the memory. He said he wanted to learn from the old soldiers, that they had stories that mattered more than money. That summer had been transformative for Marcus. He'd spent 8 hours a day reading to veterans, helping with physical therapy, just sitting and listening to men who'd fought in wars most people had forgotten. He'd come home every evening with stories about their courage, their humor, their wisdom. By the end of the summer, he'd decided to pursue medicine, inspired by doctors he'd met who treated elderly patients with genuine respect and care. Thomas and I were so proud, I said, remembering how our 17-year-old son had announced his career plans over dinner. Not because he'd chosen a prestigious profession, but because he'd chosen it for the right reasons. He wanted to serve others, to use his talents to help people when they were most vulnerable. Medical school had only strengthened those values. Marcus had specialized in pediatric surgery not because it was the most lucrative field, but because he'd felt called to help children. He'd volunteered at free clinics, provided care for uninsured families, and built a reputation not just for surgical skill, but for genuine compassion. The Marcus who married Rebecca was still that person, I told Jennifer. He was still the man who'd call me every Sunday, who'd spend his vacations helping us with house projects, who'd bring Thomas medical journals because he knew Dad loved staying current with advances in healthcare even after retirement. But then, Rebecca had entered the picture, and everything had begun to change. At first, the changes were subtle, I said. spreading out a timeline I'd created showing the progression of Marcus's transformation. Rebecca started by simply being present at family gatherings, contributing to conversations, seeming genuinely interested in our family traditions. But gradually, she began suggesting modifications. The modifications had seemed reasonable at first. Instead of our traditional Christmas Eve dinner at home, why not try the new restaurant everyone was talking about? Instead of our usual summer vacation at the lake cottage we'd rented for 20 years, why not explore somewhere more exotic? Instead of quiet Sunday dinners where we'd share news and discuss current events, why not invite other couples so Marcus could expand his professional network? Each change was presented as an improvement, I explained. A way to enhance our traditions, rather than replace them. Rebecca was brilliant at making her suggestions seem like upgrades rather than fundamental alterations to who we were as a family. But the cumulative effect had been devastating. Our intimate family gatherings became networking opportunities. Our relaxed conversations about life and values became strategic discussions about career advancement and social positioning. Our focus on service and compassion gradually gave way to emphasis on success and status. I watched my son slowly disappear. I told Jennifer, my voice heavy with the grief that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with loss of connection. The Marcus who'd spent Thanksgiving serving meals at the homeless shelter started spending holidays at country club events. The son who'd called me for advice about ethical dilemmas at work stopped calling altogether unless Rebecca was orchestrating the conversation. Thomas had noticed the changes too, but his approach had been characteristically patient. People grow and change when they get married, he'd said during one of our evening conversations about our concern for Marcus. Rebecca makes him happy, and maybe we need to trust that he knows what he wants from life. But Thomas's patience had been tested when Marcus had announced that he was too busy to help with his grandfather's care during the old man's final illness. Rebecca thinks we should consider professional assistance, Marcus had said, unable to meet his father's eyes. It's really too much for you and Mom to handle alone. Professional assistance. As if caring for family was a burden to be outsourced rather than a privilege to be shared. That's when Thomas first expressed real concern, I told Jennifer. He said Rebecca was optimizing the heart out of our family. Treating relationships like business arrangements to be managed rather than bonds to be cherished. Had come when Thomas had been diagnosed with the heart condition that would eventually kill him. Marcus, who should have been our primary support during that frightening time, had been mysteriously unavailable for most medical appointments, unable to take time off work, too committed to professional obligations to help navigate the complex medical decisions we were facing. Rebecca had convinced him that his career couldn't afford interruptions, I said, remembering the anguish in Thomas's eyes when Marcus had missed the consultation with the cardiologist who'd outlined treatment options. She'd made him believe that professional success was more important than family loyalty. By the time Thomas died, the foundation of values and love that had defined our family for nearly 50 years had been systematically undermined. The son who'd once spent his vacation time caring for veterans had become someone who couldn't take an afternoon off to support his parents through a medical crisis. And now, I told Jennifer, pulling out the cleaning schedule and assisted living brochure that represented the final assault on everything we'd built, Rebecca is trying to erase the last evidence that our family ever stood for anything meaningful. Jennifer had been taking notes throughout my narrative, but now she looked up with the expression I remembered from our most challenging cases. The look of an advocate who'd found her cause. Margaret, what Rebecca is doing isn't just elder abuse. It's cultural genocide. She's trying to destroy a way of life, a set of values, a model of how families should function, and she's using your son as the weapon to do it. I nodded, feeling the weight of that truth. The question is, can we stop her? Can we restore not just my dignity, but the foundation she spent 8 years destroying? Jennifer closed her notebook and leaned forward with the intensity that had made her legendary in courtrooms across the state. Margaret, I've been waiting. my entire career for a case like this. Not just because it's you, though that makes it personal, but because this is bigger than one family's dysfunction. This is about establishing legal protections for elderly people who are being systematically manipulated and exploited by family members who should be their greatest advocates. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. I'm calling in every favor I have. We're going to assemble a legal team that will make this case a landmark precedent for elder protection. And Margaret? Yes? We're going to do more than restore your dignity. We're going to create a legal framework that ensures no other family ever has to watch their values and traditions be destroyed by someone who sees elderly relatives as inconveniences to be managed rather than treasures to be protected. As I sat in that diner where Thomas and I had shared our first conversation about justice and protecting the vulnerable, I felt something I hadn't experienced since his death. Hope. Not just for my own situation, but for the possibility that our life's work together could continue, that the values we'd fought to protect could be preserved for future generations. Rebecca thought she was dealing with a broken widow. She had no idea she was about to face the combined legal might of every attorney who'd ever believed that dignity, respect, and family love were worth fighting for. The foundation she'd tried to destroy was about to become the bedrock for her own legal destruction. To understand how Rebecca managed to infiltrate and ultimately destroy our family's foundation, you need to know exactly how she entered our world and why we trusted her so completely. The most dangerous predators are those who study their prey, who understand exactly what their victims value most, and who present themselves as the perfect embodiment of those very values. Rebecca wasn't just a gold digger looking for financial security. She was a psychological manipulator who had turned the art of deception into a science. I returned to Marcus and Rebecca's house that afternoon with my mind buzzing from the strategic planning session with Jennifer, but also with a new understanding of how thoroughly I'd been played from the very beginning. As I walked through their front door, using the key Rebecca had pointedly given me along with instructions to use the service entrance in the future, I carried myself like the defeated widow she expected to see. But inside, my investigative instincts were fully awakened, and I was beginning to see patterns that had been invisible through the fog of grief and family loyalty. The house felt different now that I understood what it really represented. This wasn't Marcus's home. It was Rebecca's stage set, carefully designed to project success, sophistication, and control. Every expensive piece of furniture, every carefully curated artwork, every designer accessory was chosen not for comfort or personal meaning, but for the impression it would make on visitors who needed to be convinced of the resident's status and stability. As I began the afternoon cleaning tasks Rebecca had assigned, polishing silver that clearly hadn't been used since the last time, I'd cleaned it, dusting books that showed no signs of being read, organizing closets that were already immaculate. I found myself thinking back to the first time Marcus had mentioned a woman named Rebecca Chambers. It had been during one of our Sunday dinners in March 2018, about 8 months after Thomas's mild heart attack had forced him into retirement. I met someone interesting at the hospital fundraiser last week, Marcus had said, his tone carefully, casual in the way that told me this was anything but a casual mention. Rebecca Chambers. She's a pharmaceutical sales representative, but she's different from the usual salespeople. Really knowledgeable about medicine, great insights into healthcare, policy. Even then, I should have been suspicious of how she'd positioned herself. Rebecca hadn't approached Marcus as a romantic prospect. She'd presented herself as a professional equal, someone whose expertise complemented his medical knowledge. For a man who'd spent his career being pursued by women attracted to his status, as a successful surgeon, meeting someone who seemed interested in his mind rather than his paycheck must have been incredibly appealing. She has some fascinating ideas about pharmaceutical research ethics, Marcus had continued, warming to his subject. We ended up talking for 2 hours about conflicts of interest in medical research. She's actually working on a paper about transparency in drug trials. Thomas and I had exchanged glances across the dinner table, pleased that our son had met someone who seemed to share his intellectual interests, but also curious about this woman who'd made such an immediate impression on our typically reserved boy. "What's her background?" Thomas had asked, his legal mind automatically seeking the kind of biographical information that would help him assess someone's character. "Northwestern for undergrad, master's in biochemistry from Johns Hopkins," Marcus had replied with obvious admiration. "She worked in research for a few years before moving into pharmaceutical sales. Says she wanted to understand the business side of medicine, not just the science." The credentials were impressive, but as I would later learn, they were also carefully chosen to appeal to our family's specific values. Rebecca had done her homework before targeting Marcus, studying not just his professional background, but his family history, his parents' careers, the kinds of qualities that would resonate with someone raised by two attorneys who'd devoted their lives to justice and ethical practice. Over the following weeks, Rebecca's name had come up in our conversations. With increasing frequency, she was consulting with him on a research project. She'd recommended a fascinating article about healthcare policy. She'd invited him to a lecture by a visiting expert in pediatric pharmacology. Each interaction was positioned as professional collaboration rather than personal interest, which made Marcus feel like he was being valued for his expertise rather than pursued for his status. "I think you'd really like her, Mom," Marcus had said during one of these early conversations. "She reminds me of you in some ways. Really sharp, passionate about making healthcare more ethical and accessible." That comparison should have been a red flag. In my experience representing elderly victims of family exploitation, the most dangerous predators were those who studied their targets' family dynamics and presented themselves as idealized versions of beloved family members. But at the time, I'd been flattered rather than suspicious. Here was a woman who seemed to share our values, who appreciated Marcus's intellectual gifts, who was interested in the same social justice issues that had shaped our family's worldview. The first time Rebecca came to our house was for a casual dinner in May 2018, about 2 months after Marcus had first mentioned her. She arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine that was expensive enough to show respect, but not so costly as to seem ostentatious, a balance that spoke to careful consideration of the impression she wanted to make. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," she'd said when Marcus introduced us, offering a firm handshake and direct eye contact that projected confidence without arrogance. "Marcus has told me so much about you both. I feel like I already know you." She was beautiful, but not in a way that was intimidating or artificial. Her appearance was polished but approachable, the kind of woman who could be equally comfortable in a boardroom or at a community barbecue. Her clothing was professional, but not flashy. Her makeup subtle, her jewelry minimal but tasteful. Everything about her presentation suggested someone who was successful but not materialistic, confident but not self-absorbed. "I brought this Pinot Noir," she'd said, presenting, the wine with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Marcus mentioned that you both appreciate Oregon wines, and this is from a small vineyard that donates part of their profits to farm worker advocacy groups. I thought you might find that interesting given your legal work with social justice causes." The eye gesture was perfect, expensive enough to show respect, thoughtful enough to suggest she'd listened to what Marcus had told her about us, and principled enough to align with our values about supporting ethical businesses. Looking back, I can see how carefully calculated it was, but at the time, it seemed like genuine consideration from someone who wanted to make a good impression on her boyfriend's parents. During dinner, Rebecca demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of our family history that went far beyond what Marcus would have shared in casual conversation. She knew about Thomas's most famous cases, asked informed questions about my work in elder law, and showed familiarity with our published articles and legal writings that suggested she'd done extensive research. "I read your piece on power of attorney abuse in the State Bar Journal," she told me over the main course. Your argument about requiring independent legal representation for elderly principals was brilliant. Has there been any movement on implementing those recommendations? Legislatively? The question showed not just that she'd read my work, but that she understood its implications and current relevance. For someone who'd spent her career writing legal articles that most people outside the profession ignored, having a young woman show genuine interest in my ideas was incredibly flattering. I actually have some thoughts about how pharmaceutical companies could support elder advocacy, Rebecca had continued. There are some interesting models from Europe where drug companies fund independent patient advocacy programs. I'd love to get your input on whether something like that could work here. She'd managed to position herself as someone who not only appreciated my expertise, but who might be able to help advance the causes I cared about. For an attorney who'd spent decades fighting uphill battles for elder rights, the possibility of having an ally inside the pharmaceutical industry was tantalizing. Thomas had been equally charmed, particularly when Rebecca had asked detailed questions about his criminal defense work and expressed admiration for attorneys who took on difficult cases for clients who couldn't afford quality representation. Marcus mentioned that you once represented 3 different clients pro bono in the same month, she'd said to Thomas with apparent amazement. How did you manage the financial pressure of doing so much unpaid work? You do what you have to do when justice is at stake, Thomas had replied, but I could see he was pleased by her recognition of the sacrifices he'd made throughout his career. That's exactly the kind of principle I hope to bring to pharmaceutical sales, Rebecca had said earnestly. Too many sales reps just push the most expensive drugs regardless of whether they're the best option for patients. I want to build relationships with doctors who prioritize patient outcomes over profit margins. By the end of that first evening, both Thomas and I had been thoroughly impressed. Here was a young woman who seemed to embody everything we'd tried to teach Marcus about integrity, social responsibility, and using professional success to benefit others. She was intelligent without being condescending, successful without being materialistic, and genuinely interested in making a positive impact on the world. I like her, Thomas had said after Marcus and Rebecca left that evening. She's got substance. And did you see how she looked at Marcus? That's not infatuation. That's genuine respect and affection. I'd agreed completely. The way Rebecca had interacted with our son during dinner had seemed perfect, supportive without being possessive, interested in his work without being clingy, contributing to conversations without dominating them. She'd treated him like an equal partner rather than a trophy to be won, which aligned perfectly with the model of relationship Thomas and I had tried to provide. Over the following months, Rebecca had become a regular presence in our lives, and every interaction had reinforced our positive first impression. She'd attended Marcus's medical conference presentation and asked thoughtful questions that showed she'd understood the technical content. She'd volunteered to help organize our annual fundraiser for the Legal Aid Clinic, bringing professional event planning skills that elevated the entire production. She'd even joined us for Thomas's birthday celebration, bringing a gift that was both personal and meaningful. A first-edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, because Marcus had mentioned it was Thomas's favorite novel. She's perfect for him. I'd confided to Jennifer during one of our regular coffee meetings that summer. Smart enough to challenge him intellectually, principled enough to support his values, successful enough that he knows she's not just interested in his money. Jennifer had raised an eyebrow at my enthusiasm. She sounds almost too good to be true. Have you done any background checking? Jennifer, I'd laughed. She's not a litigation opponent. She's Marcus's girlfriend. Besides, what would I check? She's exactly who she says she is. That conversation had taken place in August 2018, exactly 3 months before Rebecca would convince Marcus to propose, and almost 5 years before she would hand me a cleaning schedule and tell me I'd be earning my keep as their household servant. If only I'd listened to Jennifer's instincts instead of dismissing them as professional paranoia. Because as I would eventually discover, Rebecca was indeed too good to be. True, every conversation we'd had, every interest she'd expressed, every value she'd claimed to share, it had all been performance, carefully crafted after extensive research into our family background and designed to make her seem like the perfect addition to our family. The pharmaceutical research ethics she'd discussed so knowledgeably. She'd memorized talking points from industry publications, the interest in elder law advocacy. She'd studied my published articles and learned enough terminology to sound informed. The admiration for Thomas's pro bono work. She'd researched his most famous cases and crafted responses that would appeal to his sense of pride and purpose. Most insidiously, she'd used our own values against us, because Thomas and I had raised Marcus to believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt, to look for the good in others, to trust until given reason not to trust. We'd been predisposed to accept Rebecca at face value. Our commitment to seeing the best in people had made us vulnerable to someone who specialized in presenting a false version of best that was designed to manipulate rather than reveal. As I polished Rebecca's already spotless silver service that afternoon, I thought about all the warning signs I'd missed or dismissed. The way she'd always seemed to have exactly the right opinion on every topic we discussed. The way her interests had aligned perfectly with our family's values without ever revealing any genuine passion or personal history behind those interests. The way she'd inserted herself into our family traditions without ever sharing any meaningful traditions of her own. "Where is Rebecca's family?" Thomas had asked Marcus during one of our Sunday dinners about 6 months into their relationship. "We'd love to meet her parents, her siblings, learn more about where she comes from." "Her parents live in Seattle," Marcus had replied vaguely. "They're both retired, pretty private people. Rebecca says they're not much for big family gatherings." I should have pressed for more details. In my legal work, I'd learned that people who were vague about their family backgrounds were often hiding something significant. But Rebecca had been so charming, so apparently perfect for Marcus, that I'd accepted the explanation without question. Looking back now, I could see that Rebecca had deliberately kept her personal history mysterious while encouraging us to share every detail of our family's story, our values, our traditions, our relationships. She'd been gathering intelligence while revealing nothing meaningful about herself, a classic manipulation tactic that I should have recognized if I hadn't been so emotionally invested in wanting Marcus to find happiness. The engagement had come. In February 2019, almost exactly a year after they'd first met, Marcus had proposed during a weekend trip to wine country, presenting Rebecca with a ring that must have cost 3 months of his salary, far more than the modest solitaire Thomas had given me 42 years earlier, but exactly the kind of gesture that would appeal to someone who measured love by its financial expression. "I know it's fast," Marcus had said when he'd called to share the news. "But when you know someone is right for you, why wait? Rebecca makes me want to be a better person." That phrase, "makes me want to be a better person," should have been another warning sign. The Marcus we'd raised was already committed to being the best person he could be. The fact that he felt he needed to improve himself to be worthy of Rebecca suggested that she'd been subtly undermining his self-confidence while positioning herself as the solution to inadequacies he'd never known he had. But again, I'd been so happy for Marcus's happiness that I'd ignored the implications. Thomas and I had congratulated him enthusiastically, hosted an engagement party, and begun planning for the wedding that would formally bring Rebecca into our family. The wedding itself, in June 2019, had been Rebecca's masterpiece of manipulation disguised as celebration. She'd convinced Marcus that they needed a significant ceremony befitting his professional status, which had translated into a guest list of 200 people, most of whom were Rebecca's professional contacts rather than family friends. The venue had been the most exclusive country club in the state. The catering had cost more than many people's annual salaries, and every detail had been designed to project success and sophistication rather than love and commitment. "It's important for Marcus's career that we make the right impression," Rebecca had explained when I'd gently questioned the elaborate expense. "The medical community pays attention to these things. A cheap wedding would suggest that Marcus isn't successful enough to provide properly for his wife." I should have challenged that logic. Thomas and I had been married in a simple church ceremony, followed by a reception in my parents' backyard, and somehow his legal career had thrived despite our modest celebration. But Rebecca had been so persuasive, so confident in her understanding of professional expectations, that I deferred to her judgment. The wedding had been beautiful but impersonal, elaborate but cold. As I'd watched Marcus stand at the altar, in his expensive tuxedo, waiting for Rebecca to walk down the aisle in her designer gown, I'd felt a strange sadness that had nothing to do with losing my son to marriage, and everything to do with losing him to someone who seemed to be transforming him into a person I didn't recognize. But even then, even as I'd watched Rebecca perform the role of blushing bride for an audience of pharmaceutical executives and hospital administrators, I hadn't understood what was really happening. I'd attributed my unease to normal maternal anxiety about sharing my son with another woman, rather than recognizing it as intuitive recognition of a predator who had successfully infiltrated our family. Now, as I organized Rebecca's walk-in closet according to her impossibly detailed instructions, grouping clothing by color, season, and frequency of use, I could see how methodically she'd executed her long-term plan. The beautiful young woman, who'd charmed us with her apparent shared values, had been studying us like a scientist studying lab rats, learning exactly what buttons to push to get the responses she wanted. The threat hadn't emerged all at once. It had been introduced gradually, systematically, with each boundary crossed so subtly that we'd adapted to the new normal without recognizing how far we'd strayed from our original values. By the time Rebecca handed me that cleaning schedule and told me I'd be earning my keep as their domestic servant, she'd already spent 5 years training our family to accept her authority, her priorities, her definition of what mattered. But she'd made one crucial mistake in her assessment of her targets. She'd seen Thomas and me as elderly marks to be manipulated, but she'd failed to understand that we weren't just retired lawyers. We were attorneys who'd spent our careers recognizing and dismantling exactly the kind of systematic exploitation she was attempting to implement. The threat had emerged, revealed itself fully, and now it was time for the response. Rebecca had chosen to play a game she didn't understand against opponents whose expertise she'd completely underestimated. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The deterioration of my situation accelerated rapidly over the following weeks, but so did my preparation for the legal battle that would not only restore my dignity, but establish protections for elderly people across the entire state. Rebecca, emboldened by what she perceived as my complete submission, began implementing increasingly demeaning demands while simultaneously accelerating her timeline for having me declared incompetent and institutionalized. What she didn't realize was that every new humiliation, every additional piece of evidence of her systematic abuse, was being meticulously documented by an attorney who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of building ironclad cases against people exactly like her. The morning routine Rebecca had established for me was designed to break down any remaining sense of personal dignity. I was required to be in the kitchen by 5:30 a.m. to begin preparing elaborate breakfasts that took nearly 2 hours to complete. The specifications were deliberately complex and changed daily. Eggs Benedict one morning, Belgian waffles with fresh fruit compote the next, full English breakfast complete with homemade sausage and blood pudding the day after that. Each meal came with detailed instructions written in Rebecca's precise handwriting, instructions that were designed more to establish dominance than to ensure culinary success. The hollandaise must be the perfect consistency, not too thick, not too thin, read one typical note. If it breaks, start over. I cannot tolerate imperfection in my household management. Coffee must be precisely 185 degrees. Use the thermometer every time. Marcus's productivity depends on proper caffeine delivery. All dishes must be hand-washed and dried immediately after the meal. The dishwasher is not appropriate for fine china and crystal. But it wasn't just the cooking that revealed Rebecca's psychological warfare. It was the systematic erasure of my identity as a family member. She had instituted a series of rules that were clearly designed to establish master-servant dynamics. I was to address her as Ms. Chambers at all times. Never speak unless spoken to during meals. Eat my own meals standing in the kitchen, rather. Then sitting at the table and wear the gray uniform she'd purchased to maintain appropriate household standards. The uniform was perhaps the most calculated humiliation. It was deliberately old-fashioned, a gray dress with white collar and cuffs, complete with an apron that tied in the back and a small cap that I was required to pin to my hair. It was the kind of costume you might see in a period drama about Victorian servants, designed to make absolutely clear that I was not family, not a guest, but hired help whose status was defined by my clothing. I think it's important to maintain clear boundaries, Rebecca had explained when she'd presented me with 3 identical uniforms on a Monday morning. This way, everyone understands the household hierarchy. It eliminates confusion about roles and expectations. The psychological impact was devastating. Each morning, as I put on that uniform, I felt pieces of my professional identity, my personal dignity, my sense of worth as a human being stripped away. Rebecca had calculated that the daily ritual of dressing like a servant would eventually convince me that I truly was nothing more than domestic help, grateful for shelter and dependent on her charity. What she hadn't calculated was that Margaret Sterling had spent 42 years putting on professional uniforms, business suits, judicial robes, formal court attire, that reminded her daily of her power, her expertise, her ability to fight for justice. I understood the psychology of clothing as identity, which meant I also understood how to resist its effects. Each morning, as I fastened the buttons on that demeaning gray dress, I reminded myself that I was wearing a costume for the most important performance of my legal career. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to be living in a parallel universe where his mother's degradation was somehow evidence of family harmony. Rebecca had convinced him that my domestic contributions were therapeutic, that staying busy was helping me process grief, that having purpose and structure was exactly what elderly people needed to maintain their mental health. "You seem to be adjusting well to the arrangement, Mom," he'd said one morning as I served his breakfast wearing the servant's uniform, apparently oblivious to the humiliation inherent in the scene. "Rebecca was worried you might resist having more structure in your life, but you've really embraced the opportunity to contribute." The way he'd been programmed to reframe my exploitation as opportunity, my servitude as therapy, my humiliation as adjustment was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Rebecca's manipulation. She hadn't just targeted me, she'd systematically rewired my son's moral compass until he could witness elder abuse without recognizing it as abuse. But Rebecca's confidence in her control had made her sloppy about hiding evidence of her larger scheme. As I performed my assigned cleaning duties, always wearing the uniform, always maintaining the appearance of grateful servitude, I continued, gathering documentation that revealed the stunning scope of her long-term planning. In her home office, while dusting her desk according to her detailed instructions, I discovered a folder labeled Future Planning that contained documents that made my blood run cold. There were brochures for 3 different assisted living facilities, each with handwritten notes comparing costs, admission requirements, and policies regarding family visitation. There were printouts of articles about having elderly relatives declared incompetent, with key passages highlighted in yellow marker. Most damning was a legal consultation fee receipt from a law firm that specialized in elder guardianship proceedings. But the document that revealed the true scope of Rebecca's criminal intentions was a handwritten timeline, apparently her master plan for disposing of me while gaining control of any assets I might possess. The timeline was methodical, calculated, and breathtaking in its cruelty. Phase 1, Weeks 1-4. Establish domestic arrangement. Document any signs of confusion, forgetfulness, or inability to care for self. Create paper trail showing dependency and declining capabilities. Phase 2, Weeks 5-8. Increase responsibilities and complexity of tasks. Document failures, accidents, or incidents that suggest incompetence. Begin discussing concerns about safety with Marcus. Phase 3, weeks 9 to 12. Consult with elder care attorney about guardianship proceedings. Arrange competency evaluation with sympathetic physician. Prepare institutional placement. I was currently in week 3 of Phase 1, which meant I had approximately 9 weeks before Rebecca planned to have me declared incompetent and permanently institutionalized. But more importantly, I now had documentary evidence of premeditated elder abuse, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, and systematic exploitation of a vulnerable adult, crimes that carried significant criminal penalties in addition to civil liability. My evening meetings with Jennifer Walsh had evolved into full-scale war planning sessions. We'd assembled a legal team that included 2 elder law specialists, a criminal prosecutor who'd agreed to consult on potential charges, a forensic accountant who was analyzing Rebecca's financial records, and a private investigator who was conducting background research that was revealing disturbing patterns in Rebecca's history. Margaret, what we're uncovering goes far beyond simple elder abuse, Jennifer had told me during our most recent strategy session. Rebecca Chambers has a history of targeting successful older men, ingratiating herself with their families, and positioning herself to inherit significant assets. Marcus isn't her first victim, he's just her most ambitious target. The private investigator, a former police detective named Sarah Morrison, had traced Rebecca's background through multiple identity changes and discovered a pattern of predatory relationships spanning nearly 15 years. Before Marcus, there had been Dr. Richard Pemberton, a wealthy cardiologist who died suddenly 6 months after naming Rebecca as his primary beneficiary. Before him, there had been James Anderson, a successful pharmaceutical executive who'd suffered a convenient heart attack just weeks before his ex-wife was scheduled to receive a significant settlement in their divorce proceedings. She's not just a gold digger, Sarah had explained. She's a systematic predator who studies her targets, integrates herself into their lives, isolates them from their support systems, and then benefits from their convenient deaths or incapacitation. Marcus is still alive because she needs him functional to maintain her lifestyle and social position. But you, Mrs. Sterling, were always expendable once she gained control of the household. This revelation had reframed everything. Rebecca hadn't just been trying to exploit me as unpaid domestic help. She'd been laying the groundwork for having me declared incompetent so she could gain control of my assets, my legal authority, and ultimately my life itself. The servant's uniform wasn't just about humiliation. It was about creating a visual record of my supposedly declining mental state that could be used in competency proceedings. Armed with this understanding, I'd modified my approach to gathering evidence. Instead of simply documenting Rebecca's abuse, I began creating detailed records of my own mental acuity, professional capabilities, and complete understanding of what was being done to me. I photographed the timeline and planning documents, recorded conversations where Rebecca made incriminating statements, and compiled a comprehensive portfolio that would demolish any claim that I was incompetent or unable to care for myself. Cetrain breaking point came during week 4 of Rebecca's timeline, when she decided to accelerate her schedule after what she perceived as evidence of my declining capabilities. I had deliberately made small mistakes in my domestic duties: slightly overcooked eggs, imperceptibly uneven floor polishing, minimal dust left on a bookshelf, to make her overconfident about my supposedly deteriorating condition. "Margaret, we need to have a serious conversation," Rebecca had said one evening after dismissing me from dinner cleanup duties. "I've been documenting some concerning incidents over the past few weeks, and I think it's time we discussed your long-term care needs." She'd led me to the living room, where Marcus was waiting with an expression of practiced concern that had clearly been coached by his wife. On the coffee table was a folder labeled Mother Sterling Care Assessment, containing what appeared to be a formal evaluation of my mental and physical capabilities. "We've both noticed some troubling signs," Rebecca had begun, consulting her notes with the authority of a medical professional. "Forgetfulness, confusion about simple tasks, difficulty following detailed instructions. Marcus is particularly concerned about the incident with the stove yesterday." The incident she was referring to was a moment when I deliberately left a burner on low heat for 30 seconds longer than necessary. Hardly evidence of dementia, but exactly the kind of minor mistake that could be characterized as dangerous if presented properly. "I think it might be time to consider a more structured living environment," Marcus had said, his voice heavy with what appeared to be genuine concern for my welfare. "Somewhere with professional staff who can ensure your safety and provide appropriate stimulation for someone at your stage of life." The way they'd choreographed this intervention, Rebecca documenting evidence of my decline while Marcus delivered the recommendation for institutional care, revealed how thoroughly she'd manipulated him into participating in my disposal. My son, who'd once stood up to bullies protecting children weaker than himself, was now facilitating the systematic abuse of his own mother without recognizing what he was doing. But this was also the moment I'd been preparing for. Instead of responding with the confusion or distress Rebecca was expecting, I'd reached into my purse and pulled out a folder that was significantly thicker than hers. "That's an interesting assessment," I'd said calmly, setting my folder on the table next to hers. "I've been conducting my own evaluation of this household, and I think you'll find my documentation considerably more comprehensive." The change in Rebecca's expression had been immediate and dramatic. The confident authority she'd maintained throughout her presentation had evaporated, replaced by wariness that suggested she was beginning to understand that something had gone very wrong with her carefully laid plans. "I don't understand," Marcus had said, looking between my folder and Rebecca's with genuine confusion. "What your wife has been characterizing as signs of mental decline," I'd explained, opening my folder to reveal photographs, legal documents, recorded conversations, and detailed timelines, are actually evidence of my continuing professional competence as an attorney specializing in exactly the kind of elder abuse that's been perpetrated against me in this household. I'd laid out the evidence methodically, the way I'd presented countless cases in courtrooms across the state. Rebecca's planning documents, her research into guardianship proceedings, her consultation with elder care attorneys, her systematic humiliation designed to establish my supposed incompetence, all of it documented, photographed, and cross-referenced with applicable state and federal laws regarding elder abuse. "Furthermore," I'd continued, "my investigation has revealed that this pattern of behavior isn't isolated to my situation. Rebecca Chambers has a documented history of targeting successful older men, inserting herself into their families, and benefiting from their convenient deaths or incapacitation." Marcus's face had gone white as I'd presented the evidence about Rebecca's previous victims. The suspicious deaths, the pattern of inheritance that suggested something far more sinister than simple gold digging. "This is ridiculous," Rebecca had said, but her voice lacked conviction, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to calculate damage control options. "You're clearly experiencing paranoid delusions. Marcus, this is exactly the kind of irrational behavior we've been concerned about." "Actually," I'd said, pulling out my phone, "I think we should let the professionals make that determination." I'd placed a call that connected me directly to Detective Morrison, who'd been standing by for exactly this moment. "Detective, this is Margaret Sterling. I'm ready to file formal charges of elder abuse, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, and attempted financial exploitation. The perpetrators are present, and I'm requesting immediate response." The next hour had been a blur of police interviews, evidence collection, and the systematic dismantling of Rebecca's carefully constructed facade. Detective Morrison had arrived with a team that included specialists in elder abuse crimes, and they'd methodically documented everything. The servant's uniform I was wearing, the degrading task lists Rebecca had created, the planning documents that revealed her systematic approach to disposing of me. But perhaps the most devastating moment had been when Marcus, finally understanding the true nature of what his wife had been doing, had broken down completely. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he'd said, tears streaming down his face as he'd watched Rebecca being read her rights. "I didn't see it. I didn't understand what she was doing. You tried to teach me to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And I failed when you needed me most. Marcus, I'd said gently, taking his hands in mine, you're not the first person to be manipulated by someone like Rebecca. She's a professional predator who spent years studying our family to learn exactly how to turn our values against us. The important thing is that you're seeing clearly now. Rebecca's arrest had been just the beginning of a legal process that would ultimately establish landmark precedents for elder protection across the state. The charges against her included elder abuse, conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, identity theft related to her previous victims, and multiple counts of financial exploitation. The evidence was so comprehensive, so meticulously documented, that her defense attorney had immediately begun negotiating for a plea agreement. But I hadn't been interested in plea bargains. This case was about more than just my personal justice. It was about creating legal protections that would prevent other elderly people from facing the systematic exploitation I'd endured. I wanted a trial that would expose Rebecca's methods, establish clear legal precedents, and send a message to anyone who might consider targeting vulnerable seniors. The trial had been a media sensation, not just because of the shocking nature of the crimes, but because of the unusual situation of an elderly victim who was also the lead prosecutor's expert witness. My testimony had lasted 3 days, during which I'd presented not just the evidence of my own abuse, but a comprehensive analysis of elder exploitation tactics that would become required reading in law schools across the country. Rebecca Chambers represents a new category of predator, I'd told the jury during my final day of testimony. She's not the desperate family member driven to theft by financial crisis, nor is she the addicted relative who steals to feed a compulsion. She's a calculating criminal who has turned the systematic exploitation of elderly people into a professional enterprise. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Rebecca had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. But more importantly, the case had resulted in legislation that strengthened protections for elderly people, made it easier to prosecute family members who exploited seniors, and established mandatory reporting requirements for suspected elder abuse. The personal resolution had been equally satisfying. Marcus, horrified by his unwitting participation in his mother's abuse, had immediately moved me back into my own home and begun a process of rebuilding our relationship based on the values Thomas and I had tried to instill in him. He'd also entered therapy to understand how he'd been manipulated and to ensure he'd never again be vulnerable to such systematic psychological exploitation. I want to do something meaningful with the experience, he'd told me 6 months after Rebecca's conviction. I've been thinking about establishing a foundation that provides legal advocacy for elderly people who are being exploited by family members. The Margaret Sterling Foundation for Elder Justice had become one of the most effective advocacy organizations in the state, providing free legal representation for seniors facing family exploitation and funding research into the psychological tactics used by predators who target elderly victims. Marcus had also returned to his medical practice with a renewed focus on recognizing signs of elder abuse among his patients, and he'd become a leading advocate for training healthcare professionals to identify and report suspected exploitation. For me, the experience had led to what Jennifer called my second legal career. At 74, I'd become the state's leading expert on elder abuse prosecution, consulting on cases across the country and training law enforcement officers to recognize the sophisticated tactics used by modern predators who target seniors. The case against Rebecca had been featured in legal textbooks, and my approach to documenting systematic abuse had become the standard protocol for elder abuse investigations. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome had been the restoration of my relationship with Marcus and the renewal of our family's commitment to the values Thomas and I had tried to build our lives around. We'd resumed our Sunday dinners, our conversations about justice and protecting the vulnerable, our shared commitment to using our professional skills to benefit others. "Dad would be proud of how you handled Rebecca," Marcus had said during one of these dinners. About a year after the trial, you turned your own victimization into a way to protect other people. That's exactly the kind of justice work he believed in. We all did our part, I'd replied. You found your way back to the values we raised you with. Rebecca thought she could destroy our family's foundation, but she actually ended up strengthening it. The servant's uniform that Rebecca had forced me to wear was now displayed in my office, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of the lengths I'd been willing to go to gather evidence and protect other elderly people from similar exploitation. Law students who visited my office often asked about it, and I'd tell them the story of how sometimes the most effective way to fight injustice is to appear powerless while you're actually gathering the tools for your opponent's destruction. Legal advocacy isn't just about courtroom arguments and judicial decisions, I'd explain to these young lawyers. Sometimes it's about understanding your opponent well enough to let them reveal their true nature, gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance of helplessness, and having the patience to build an ironclad case that will protect not just yourself, but everyone who might face similar threats in the future. Rebecca Chambers had thought she was dealing with a helpless elderly widow who could be easily manipulated and disposed of. Instead, she'd encountered an attorney with 4 decades of experience dismantling exactly the kind of systematic exploitation she'd tried to implement. She'd thought my age made me vulnerable. In reality, my experience made me invincible. The wake-up call I'd given her wasn't just about exposing her crimes. It was about demonstrating that dignity, competence, and the ability to fight for justice don't diminish with age. That elderly people aren't automatically victims to be preyed upon, but human beings who deserve respect, protection, and the full weight of legal justice when they're targeted by predators. Today, 3 years after Rebecca's conviction, I continue my work advocating for elder rights and training law enforcement officers to recognize sophisticated exploitation schemes. The Margaret Sterling Foundation has helped dozens of elderly people escape abusive situations and has funded research that's led to stronger legal protections for seniors across the country. And every morning, when I wake up in my own home, wearing my own clothes, making my own decisions about how to spend my time and energy, I remember the lesson that Rebecca Chambers learned too late. You should never underestimate someone just because they're elderly, grieving, or temporarily vulnerable. Because sometimes the person you think is powerless is actually the most dangerous opponent you could possibly face. The servant's uniform hangs in my office as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come from allowing our opponents to underestimate us, that dignity can never truly be taken away by external circumstances, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice being prepared with the thoroughness and precision that ensures it will be complete, devastating, and permanent. Rebecca thought she was giving me a wake-up call about my powerlessness. Instead, I gave her a wake-up call about the consequences of targeting someone who had spent her entire career protecting people like herself. The predator became the prey, the abuser became the convicted criminal, and the supposedly helpless elderly woman became the architect of legal precedents that will protect vulnerable seniors for generations to come. That's what real justice looks like, not just punishment for the guilty, but protection for the innocent, and a clear message to anyone who might consider targeting the vulnerable that they do so at their own peril. The maid became the master of her own destiny, and the supposed servant became the instrument of justice that her oppressor never saw coming. 5 years have passed since Rebecca Chambers was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, and the ripple effects of our legal victory continue to spread far beyond what I could have imagined when I first put on that demeaning gray uniform and began gathering evidence for what would become the most important case of my career. What started as one elderly woman's fight for dignity has evolved into a nationwide movement that has fundamentally changed how our society protects its most vulnerable citizens. I'm writing this final chapter on a crisp autumn morning in my own home, the same house where Thomas and I built our life together, where we raised Marcus with values of justice and compassion, where I now host monthly meetings of the Elder Justice Coalition that has grown to include advocates from all 50 states, "The irony isn't lost on me that Rebecca's attempt to strip away my dignity and independence has ultimately resulted in my having more influence and purpose than at any point in my 78 years of life." The servant's uniform still hangs in my office, but it's no longer alone. It's now part of a larger display that tells the complete story of elder abuse recognition and prevention, a museum-quality exhibit that includes artifacts from dozens of cases where elderly people were exploited by family members who saw them as inconveniences rather than treasures. Law students, social workers, and law enforcement officers from across the country visit this display as part of their training, learning to recognize the warning signs that might save someone else's life and dignity. Last month, I received a letter that exemplified why this work matters so much. It came from Detective Sarah Martinez in Phoenix, who had used the investigation protocols we'd developed during Rebecca's case to uncover a family exploitation ring that had been targeting elderly immigrants for over a decade. "Mrs. Sterling," Detective Martinez had written, "your case materials gave us the roadmap to recognize patterns we'd been missing for years. We've now prosecuted 17 family members who were systematically exploiting their elderly relatives, and we've established a specialized elder abuse unit that has already prevented dozens of additional cases. More importantly, we've created a support network that helps elderly victims rebuild their lives with dignity intact." Stories like this arrive almost daily now. A prosecutor in Maine who used our legal precedents to convict an adult son who'd been stealing his mother's Social Security checks. A social worker in Texas who recognized the psychological manipulation tactics Rebecca had used and intervened before an elderly client was placed in an unnecessary nursing home. A judge in California who cited our case when establishing new requirements for independent legal representation in guardianship proceedings. But perhaps the most meaningful communication I've received came from an unexpected source, a letter that arrived exactly 4 years after Rebecca's conviction, postmarked from the federal correctional institution where she's serving her sentence. "Mrs. Sterling," Rebecca had written in the precise handwriting I remembered from her degrading task lists, "I know I have no right to contact you and I don't expect you to respond. But the victim impact programs here have helped me understand, for the first time, the true scope of what I did to you and to others. I spent years telling myself that I was simply taking advantage of opportunities, that elderly people were naturally dependent and might as well be useful. I never allowed myself to see my victims as human beings with full lives, professional accomplishments, family relationships, and inherent dignity." She'd continued for 3 pages, detailing her participation in prison counseling programs, her work with other inmates who'd committed crimes against elderly victims, and her collaboration with researchers studying the psychology of family exploitation. Most surprisingly, she'd included a formal affidavit detailing additional crimes she'd committed that hadn't been uncovered during the investigation, crimes that led to the exoneration of 2 people who'd been wrongly suspected in the deaths of her previous victims. "I'm writing," she'd concluded, "not to seek forgiveness, which I don't deserve, but to tell you that your refusal to be broken by my abuse has created changes that extend far beyond my conviction. The educational programs you've developed are now used in prisons across the federal system. Inmates who've committed similar crimes are being confronted with the humanity of their victims in ways that are actually changing behavior. You turned your victimization into a tool for preventing future crimes, and I wanted you to know that even from prison, I've seen evidence of lives being saved by your work." I had shown this letter to Marcus, who'd read it with the same mixture of amazement and pride that had characterized his attitude toward my second career as an elder rights advocate. "She's right, you know," he'd said, setting the letter aside with a shake of his head. "You didn't just beat her. You've created something that's protecting people she'll never even meet." Marcus himself had become one of the most effective advocates for elder protection in the medical community. His experience of being manipulated into participating in his own mother's abuse had given him unique insights into how family dynamics could be weaponized against vulnerable seniors. He'd developed training programs for healthcare professionals that were now used in medical schools across the country, teaching doctors and nurses to recognize the subtle signs of elder abuse that might not be immediately obvious during routine medical visits. The hardest part for me, Marcus had told me during one of our restored Sunday dinners, is understanding how completely I'd been programmed to see your exploitation as normal, even beneficial. Rebecca convinced me that reducing you to domestic servitude was actually helping your mental health, that giving you purpose and structure was what elderly people needed. He'd paused, setting down his fork with the same thoughtful expression he'd had as a child when wrestling with complex moral questions. It makes me realize how many other families might be going through similar situations without recognizing them as abuse. How many adult children have been convinced that exploiting their elderly parents is actually kindness? This insight had led to one of our most important innovations: family education programs that taught adult children to recognize when they were being manipulated into participating in elder abuse. The programs had been challenging to develop because they required acknowledging that loving, well-intentioned family members could become unwitting accomplices to systematic exploitation. The manipulation often works by reframing abuse as care, I'd explained to a group of social workers during a training session last spring. Rebecca convinced Marcus that forcing me to work as domestic help was therapy for grief. She presented my humiliation as dignity, my exploitation as purpose, my isolation as protection. Adult children who've been subjected to this kind of psychological manipulation genuinely believe they're helping their elderly parents, even as they participate in their degradation. The training programs had been remarkably effective. In just 3 years, they'd been implemented in over 200 communities across the country, and early data suggested they were preventing elder abuse by helping family members recognize manipulation tactics before exploitation could become entrenched. But our work had expanded beyond just preventing family exploitation. The legal precedents established during Rebecca's trial had created new opportunities for elderly people to seek justice in situations that previously would have been dismissed as family disputes. The Margaret Sterling Legal Defense Fund, established, with donations from attorneys across the country, now provided free legal representation for elderly people facing exploitation, and our success rate in court had been extraordinary. What makes these cases different, Jennifer Walsh had explained to a reporter doing a feature story on our work, is that we're not just seeking individual justice. We're building a comprehensive legal framework that protects elderly people's right to dignity, autonomy, and respect. Each case we win makes it easier for the next victim to seek help and get justice. The fund had grown beyond our wildest expectations. What had started as a small legal aid program had evolved into a national organization with chapters in 37 states. We now employed over 200 attorneys, social workers, and victim advocates, all specializing in different aspects of elder protection. The organization had become largely self-sustaining through a combination of private donations, government grants, and court-awarded attorney fees from successful prosecutions. One of our most innovative programs was the Elder Dignity Restoration initiative, which focused not just on punishing abusers, but on helping victims rebuild their lives after exploitation. Too many elderly people who escaped abusive situations found themselves isolated, financially devastated, and struggling to regain their sense of self-worth after years of systematic degradation. Surviving abuse is just the first step, I'd told a congressional committee that was considering federal funding for elder protection programs. Recovery requires comprehensive support that addresses not just the legal and financial damage, but the psychological impact of being victimized by people who were supposed to love and protect you. The restoration program provided counseling, financial planning, legal advocacy, and perhaps most importantly, community connections that helped elderly survivors rebuild social networks that had been destroyed by their abusers. We'd learned that isolation was both a tool of abuse and a lasting consequence of it, and our most successful interventions focused on reconnecting survivors with purpose, community, and hope. The program had produced remarkable success stories. Eleanor Rodriguez, who'd been financially exploited by her grandson for over 3 years, had not only recovered her stolen assets, but had become a peer counselor helping other elderly victims. Dr. Robert Kim, whose adult children had convinced him he was incompetent and forced him into unnecessary assisted living, had returned to his medical practice and was now helping us develop healthcare protocols for recognizing elder abuse. Margaret Chen, yes, another Margaret, who'd been reduced to unpaid domestic labor by her daughter-in-law, had become a legal advocate specializing in employment law violations against elderly family members. These survivors had become some of our most effective advocates because they understood from personal experience exactly what victims were going through. Their voices carried authority that no outside expert could match, and their success in rebuilding their lives provided hope for new victims who often felt that their situations were hopeless. The international attention our work had received had been unexpected but incredibly valuable. Delegations from 12 countries had visited our programs to learn about American innovations in elder protection, and we'd been invited to share our expertise with the United Nations Commission on Aging. The recognition had brought additional resources and had helped establish similar programs in countries where elder abuse had previously received little legal attention. "What you've accomplished," Dr. Amanda Foster from the World Health Organization had told me during a conference in Geneva, "is creating a model that treats elder abuse not as an inevitable consequence of aging, but as a preventable crime that demands sophisticated legal, social, and psychological intervention." But for all the professional recognition and program expansion, the most meaningful aspect of this work remained deeply personal. Every victim we helped represented someone's mother, father, grandmother, or grandfather, someone who deserved to live their final years with dignity, respect, and love, rather than exploitation and abuse. Last week, I received a call from Thomas Henderson, an 82-year-old retired teacher whose daughter had been systematically stealing from his pension fund, while convincing him that his memory problems made him unable to manage his own finances. Our legal team had not only recovered his stolen money, but had also helped him obtain a competency evaluation that proved his cognitive abilities were completely intact. "Mrs. Sterling," he'd said during our phone conversation, his voice strong and clear, "I want you to know that you've given me my life back. Before your lawyers got involved, I was beginning to believe that maybe I really was losing my mind, that maybe I really was a burden who couldn't take care of himself. Now I'm back in my own apartment, managing my own affairs, and volunteering as a literacy tutor. I feel like myself again." These calls came regularly. Elderly people whose dignity had been restored, whose independence had been preserved, whose final years would be spent in security and respect rather than exploitation and fear. Each conversation reminded me why Rebecca's attempt to break my spirit had ultimately failed so completely. The legal precedents we'd established had been cited in over 300 cases across the country, and the conviction rate for elder abuse prosecution had increased dramatically as law enforcement officers learned to recognize and properly investigate these crimes. The training materials we'd developed were now standard curriculum in police academies and legal education programs, ensuring that future generations of law enforcement and legal professionals would be better equipped to protect elderly victims. Perhaps, most importantly, we'd change the cultural conversation about aging and family responsibility. The old assumption that elderly people were automatically dependent and should be grateful for any attention had given way to recognition that aging didn't diminish a person's right to respect, autonomy, and dignity. What Margaret Sterling's case taught us, Judge Patricia Morrison had said during a keynote speech at the National Conference on Elder Justice, is that the vulnerability that comes with aging doesn't make someone less deserving of legal protection. It makes them more deserving of it. Our legal system has an obligation to ensure that elderly people's rights are protected with the same vigor we apply to protecting children, and that family relationships don't create exceptions to basic human dignity. This shift in perspective had influenced legislation, judicial decisions, and social attitudes in ways that extended far beyond formal legal protections. Adult children were having different conversations with their aging parents about care needs and financial planning. Healthcare providers were receiving better training in recognizing abuse. Financial institutions were implementing new protections against exploitation of elderly customers. The ripple effects had even reached into popular culture. Television shows, movies, and books were beginning to portray elderly characters as complex, capable individuals rather than helpless dependents. The stereotypes that had made people like me vulnerable to exploitation were slowly being replaced by more accurate representations of the diversity and capability that exists among elderly people. As I prepared for tomorrow's speaking engagement at the International Conference on Elder Rights, where I'll be presenting our latest research on preventing financial exploitation, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from Rebecca's kitchen, wearing a servant's uniform and preparing breakfast at 5:30 a.m., to addressing audiences of professionals from around the world about protecting elderly people's fundamental human rights. The transformation hadn't just been personal, it had been societal. Rebecca's attempt to reduce me to nothing more than unpaid domestic help had inadvertently triggered a movement that had protected thousands of elderly people and would continue protecting thousands more for generations to come. This evening, Marcus and I had dinner together, as we do every Sunday, continuing the tradition that Thomas and I had established 48 years ago and that Rebecca had tried so hard to destroy. As we shared stories about our week's work, his medical practice and advocacy efforts, my ongoing legal cases and policy development, I was struck by how completely our family's foundation had been restored and strengthened. "Dad would be amazed by what you've accomplished," Marcus had said as we cleared the dishes together. He always said that the law should protect people who couldn't protect themselves. You've made that principle a reality for elderly people. Across the entire country. We've made it a reality, I'd corrected him. Your work in the medical community, your advocacy for training healthcare professionals, your foundation, all of that has been essential to creating comprehensive protection for elderly people. As I tucked away the dishes in my own kitchen, in my own home, wearing my own comfortable clothes chosen for my own preferences, I thought about the profound truth that had emerged from my experience with Rebecca. Attempts to destroy what is fundamentally good often end up making it stronger, more visible, and more powerful than it was before. Rebecca had seen an elderly widow and assumed vulnerability. She'd seen grief and assumed weakness. She'd seen age and assumed incompetence. Every assumption had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. The supposedly helpless victim had possessed exactly the expertise needed to dismantle her predatory schemes. The supposedly dependent elder had sufficient resources and connections to build a legal coalition that could challenge her crimes. The supposedly declining mind had retained all the analytical power and professional skill needed to document her abuse comprehensively enough to ensure conviction and establish lasting legal protections. The servant's uniform that Rebecca had forced me to wear had become a symbol of strategic patience and ultimate victory. The degrading tasks she'd assigned had provided access to evidence that destroyed her. The isolation she'd imposed had given me time to plan and prepare for legal battle. Every tool she'd used to control and humiliate me had been transformed into an instrument of her own defeat. But beyond the personal victory, beyond even the professional satisfaction of building programs that had helped thousands of people, the most meaningful outcome had been the restoration and strengthening of the values Thomas and I had tried to build our lives around. The belief that every person deserves dignity regardless of their age or circumstances. The conviction that families should protect and cherish their elderly members rather than exploit them. The understanding that vulnerability creates obligations for protection, not opportunities for abuse. These values, which Rebecca had tried so hard to destroy, had not only survived, but had been embedded into legal frameworks, educational programs, and social policies that would protect vulnerable elderly people for generations to come. The foundation she'd attacked had become the bedrock for a movement that would outlast all of us. Tomorrow, I'll speak to an international audience about the work we've accomplished and the work that still needs to be done. I'll talk about legal strategies, policy innovations, and program development. But I'll also talk about something more fundamental. The truth that dignity is not something that can be taken away by external circumstances, that competence doesn't diminish simply because someone needs help, and that the most dangerous mistake a predator can make is underestimating someone based on their age or apparent vulnerability. 5 years ago, Rebecca Chambers thought she was giving me a wake-up call about my powerlessness in her household. Instead, I gave her, and everyone like her, a wake-up call about the consequences of targeting someone who refuses to accept victimization as inevitable. The maid became the master of her own destiny, the servant became the architect of justice, and the supposedly broken widow became the foundation for a movement that will protect elderly people long after I'm gone. That's what real legacy looks like, not just surviving abuse, but transforming the experience into protection for others. Not just winning individual justice, but creating systemic change that prevents future crimes. Not just restoring personal dignity, but establishing the principle that dignity is a fundamental right that doesn't diminish with age. The gray uniform hangs in my office as a reminder of where this journey began, but it's no longer a symbol of humiliation. It's become a symbol of the most important truth I've learned in 7 decades of life. Sometimes the greatest victories come from allowing our opponents to underestimate us while we gather the tools for their complete and permanent defeat. Rebecca wanted to strip away my dignity, my independence, and my voice. Instead, she gave me a platform to fight for the dignity, independence, and voices of elderly people everywhere. She thought she was reducing me to nothing. Instead, she helped me become everything I was meant to be. And that, perhaps, is the greatest wake-up call of all. The realization that our attempts to diminish others often end up revealing the full extent of their strength, and that true power lies not in the ability to control others, but in the capacity to transform even the most painful experiences into forces for justice, protection, and positive change. The servant's story has become a testament to the unbreakable nature of human dignity and the power of refusing to be diminished by those who mistake age for weakness, grief for helplessness, or vulnerability for defeat. In the end, love and justice proved stronger than manipulation and abuse. Dignity proved more powerful than humiliation, and the supposed victim became the architect of her oppressor's downfall. That's a wake-up call that will resonate for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.